heard that School of Motion acquired Mograph Mentor earlier this year, you're going to see some of this previously behind a paywall content be released and accessible on schoolofmotion.com. So keep checking back here for more. Thanks.
Shape layers in After Effects are extremely important and useful to understand. If you're new to shape layers, I mentioned it earlier that it acts as kind of a container, and there's all sorts of things that can happen within any individual shape layer. And this becomes extremely useful for, animation projects that are going to be really heavy on shape layers, and you're going to want to do, duplicates and control different parameters here and different things there. And it can seem a little complicated at first, but really it's pretty simple once you can wrap your mind around it. So if you're newer to shape layers, the point of this content here is to help you understand the structure of what's going on, help you see some of the possibilities of what happens here commonly within shape layers, and just demystify this part of After Effects where, so much of the 2D shape-driven, design-driven motion work really rests on a good understanding of shape layers. So let's go ahead and dive into After Effects and do a little bit of a deep dive on shape layers. So I want to create a new composition just by clicking on this here. I'll simply call this Shape Layers 1920 1080, 24 frames per second at 30 seconds is fine. To create a new shape layer, as we saw previously, we can come up to this shape menu, and if we add a shape to the scene, it automatically adds a shape layer down here in our layer panel. If I go and delete that, another way I can go about doing this is actually just to create a blank shape layer. So if I control click down here where my layers ought to be, it's going to bring up yet another submenu where we can say new, and then one of the options here is shape layer. So I can create a shape layer. Now we don't see a shape, but we have a shape layer. And the big idea here is that a shape layer is actually kind of a container that could hold one shape to a million shapes, right? It's kind of a container where we can put lots of vector-based artwork and then be able to manipulate it. So we created this shape layer and it's empty. Now, if I go ahead and toggle it down and look at it, we'll see it has this tab here called Contents, and there's just nothing there. So with this layer selected, now if I want to add a shape layer, and I'll hold Shift to constrain a perfect circle, we'll see that ellipse 1 appears in the contents. And again, so I'll create another one. And now ellipse 2, the shape layer is still selected, so I could create yet another one. And now I'm just stacking shapes inside of the shape layer. So one more way that you can create a shape layer is to come up to the very top menu where it says Layer, and look at this submenu where it says New and New Shape Layer. And the same thing will happen again, where we have a shape layer, but if we toggle it open, its contents are empty. Because we didn't start with a shape. Now, most commonly, I'll just start by creating a shape, and then that's how I'll initiate a shape layer, but there are 3 different ways that we can bring a shape layer into our scene here. So with the shape layer selected, let's go ahead and create some circles in here, and I'll hold down Shift to constrain as a perfect circle, and if I want to move the position around, I hold the space bar, and that's how I'm actually going to be able to move it around the scene. So now I've added, let's actually add one more ellipse here as we did before. And we'll see that now we have these 3 ellipses here in the contents. And the next big thing to understand about the shape layer is each of these objects, each of these shapes can be manipulated independently. And so we see a toggle down for each of these ellipses. Go ahead and make this menu a little bit bigger so we can see. I've toggled down my 3 ellipses, and we'll see that I've got a series of information about each object in the scene. And so the first one is the path, and this really refers to, okay, what is the shape? What is the form? And by default in After Effects, there is a kind of a base shape, and then there's a Bezier path. And a Bezier path is the idea that we'd be able to manipulate the handles on each point of the shapes that we have. And so by default, we can't do that right out of the box here. So these ellipses, we're going to see I don't have any points on these ellipses to be able to actually manipulate the shape. If I go to ellipse path 1 and control click, we're going to see a submenu that allows me to say convert to Bezier path. And when I go ahead and do that, it changed from where it said ellipse path to now just saying path 1. And we're going to see if I hit V on the keyboard to bring up my general selection tool, now I can actually independently change the points of this circle here And we have not converted ellipse 1 and ellipse 2, so you can't really convert individual points. All it gives you is basically kind of a bounding box to be able to change essentially the scale in the X or the Y of each of those shapes. So that is a big detail to learn about shape layers is, there's going to be times when you don't ever need to touch that and you just literally want basic shapes. There's going to be other times where you want that flexibility to be able to actually change and animate and morph the individual points on a path. So converting to Bezier path can sometimes be a pretty common thing to do in After Effects. Now, each of these objects also contains the information of stroke and fill. And so After Effects is basically concerned with what's the path, and am I filling it, which means the color fills it in entirely, or is it just a stroke? The last piece of information related to each of these objects is its transform, or really its position or its scale, meaning each of these shapes acts as kind of its own layer, right? We could scale this layer, we could change the position of this layer, we can change the anchor point of this layer, we can actually skew it, we can change the skew axis, we can rotate, and we can change its opacity. So each of these objects basically has its own layer transform settings like any layer in After Effects would have. Now, we also have blending modes here, okay? So on each of these objects, we also see this menu down the center here that says mode, and that's really referring to blending modes. So at the actual shape layer level, at the very top, we can choose blending modes, right? We could overlay, soft light, whatever, like we have in Photoshop. Each of these individually has their own blending modes as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and change that back to a normal blending mode. Now with each of these shapes selected, just when I have ellipse 3 selected here, I'm gonna see this top menu here that is actually corresponding to the information on each of these, which is the fill and the stroke. So if we want a different color, we can simply do that. And if I select ellipse 2, I'm gonna see that it's very dynamic actually to change all this really quickly. And let's talk about the actual fill options here. So if you click on the word fill, you'll be presented with yet another sub-menu where you can basically turn it on, turn it off, choose a linear gradient, or choose a radial gradient. So let's go ahead and turn off the fill for this one and click on the word stroke to turn it on. And now we have a stroked object which enables this last part of this menu here, which is the pixel count, which is just referring to the thickness of the stroke, right? So this could be extremely thick all the way to the point of being filled in, or extremely thin, all the way down to, even half a pixel, right? Or even 0.1 of a pixel. Let's go ahead and set that at 1 pixel. And so that is really the basic information that After Effects is assigning to each of these shape layers, and you're going to be using it a lot as we go forward. So let's go back to ellipse 3 and go back to this fill, and we kind of glossed over it before, but we can actually put a gradient on this shape layer. So I'm going to actually ask for a linear gradient and say OK. And if you can see closely here inside of my shape layer, basically a new set of handles has emerged, and this is basically our gradient tool within our ellipse. And we'll see that now that fill here down in the submenu actually says gradient fill. And when we have this word selected, gradient fill, we should see this menu. And so let's go ahead and move the 2 points. And sometimes that center point can hide behind the anchor point, but you just got to know that it's there, basically. And so with the gradient fill selected, now we can manipulate that gradient. The good news as well is that we can animate the start point and the end point. So we could say this is where our gradient starts, quickly set 2 keyframes, go forward a couple seconds, and then manually change these. Now we've just animated the color, the gradient, on this ellipse. So if you're new to shape layers, I hope that this helped you basically understand the basic idea, basically what After Effects wants, what we can do. But now let's build on this and do a little bit more complexity with our understanding of shape layers. So let's move on.
My name is Jessica. I'm a video editor, but my company decided to take our videos to the next level and do more animated videos. I needed to learn to animate very quickly. I came in knowing nothing about motion graphics, and I left knowing how to make things move. I've gone from being able to do the screencast on my computer to being able to make videos with assets I can create myself. You know, whether you're at level 0 or whether you just need to polish up on certain skills, I thought it was perfect. My name is Jessica, and I am a School of Motion alumni.
This short piece of content here is a little bit of a deep dive into parenting. I just want to quickly talk about within After Effects the two main ways that we parent things, which is either to use the pick whip and just go ahead and parent one layer to another, or, toggling down actual parameters and making connections between values on different layers as a different, more subtle approach to parenting, which can be important to leverage as you're trying to do more complex things. So let's go ahead and dive into After Effects and talk a little bit about parenting. So let's go ahead and create a new composition, and I'll call this parenting. I'm working at 24 frames per second. And let's go ahead and add a shape layer as we've been doing. I'm just going to stick it right in the center of the composition. With the shape layer selected, I'll turn off the stroke and just leave that gradient fill. Actually, I'm going to adjust that gradient fill so it's nice and even, just because it's fun to work with a pretty shape. And so we've talked about animating single things, but sometimes there's a value to parenting an object to another object and then animating the parent and leaving your base object free to do a second layer of animation, or kind of a secondary animation. And this can be useful in all sorts of scenarios. So After Effects gives us what's called a null object. And a null object is basically an empty layer that allows you to parent onto it. And null objects become extremely common in an After Effects workflow. And to create a null object, it's very similar. We can control-click down here to bring up this subpanel and ask for a null object. We can go up to the layer menu here and ask for a null object as well. I'll just go ahead and drop a null object in the scene. And it's represented by this red square, that has its points as well, but it's basically empty. There's no artwork in it. It's not an adjustment layer. It doesn't change anything in our scene. But the important part is that we can come back to this idea of PSR, position, scale, rotation, and I'll hit P, S, and R to look at each of those values. Now, After Effects puts parenting really front and center. So in the submenu, right here in my layer panel, I'm going to see where it says parent and link. And it's got this fun spiral icon, and this is called the pick whip. And you hover over it and it says parent pick whip. And basically this allows you to do parenting from one layer to the next. So we could, parent this shape layer up to this null object by grabbing the pick whip and moving it over. Now the null object should be controlling any adjustments to its child, right? So now the null object is the parent, so I could set some keyframes, and that base object is going with it. Now, if we want to undo this link, if we say, I made a mistake, I don't want to do that, our parenting is represented here in this menu here, where it says parenting and link. It says null 1, and this is a way to parent to anything else in your composition, or go back to none. So now we're going to see the null object moves, but the shape layer does not. So this is the basic idea behind parenting, and it's really useful. Now we can parent at the layer level, and the pick whip, After Effects puts it right here, front and center, where we can do that kind of, parenting from one layer to a next. But if I hit P on the shape layer, we're going to see that the icon doubles up. It's showing us two pick whips, and it's an important distinction here in After Effects that we can also parent specific properties. So we could parent the position of the shape layer to the position of the null object, as opposed to parenting the entire layer. And the reason that would be useful is because when you parent the entire layer, position and scale get parented. But let's say you just want to parent position and you don't want it to be affected by scale. This is where, parenting individual parameters together allows you to do that. So if we grab the pick whip, and we have to make sure that it's this pick whip off to the right, and it's not the layer level pick whip, but it's the property pick whip, and we parent that to a similar property on the null object, which is the position, Now we should see that's happening again, but if we go to the null object and we hit S for scale, we're going to see this scales up, but it does not scale our base element here. So that's really the big distinction with After Effects when it comes to parenting, is whether you're going to parent layers together or whether you're going to look at individual properties and parent those. Now, this is really also the foundation of basic rigging in After Effects, where you can, basically create controls and parent values and create controller layers. So it's important to establish this now so that as we get into some of that more complex stuff, that it kind of makes sense. So just to illustrate that example, let's go ahead and set it up real quick. I'm going to bring up this submenu again. And this time, let's go ahead and create an adjustment layer. And on this adjustment layer, I want to come into my effects panels and come to this submenu here where it says expression controls. Now, I'm going to choose this expression control here that says point control. And basically what it's going to do is basically put kind of a position parameter, a 960 by 540. We'll see it's basically saying an X and Y value here in this effect. Now we can come back to our layer panel here at the bottom, toggle it open, take a look at our effects, look at our point control. And now with this shape layer, we could take this property pick whip and bring it up to this point layer. And we're going to see that snaps to the exact position because now we're parenting the data of this controller here, this point controller. So if we move this around, we're going to see this should start to follow or adopt because it's a child. So now we've parented to a controller. So this becomes useful for rigging, where now I have this adjustment layer, which I could just name control layer, which is basically just a blank layer, but now I could stack a whole series of controllers and then parent everything to those individual controllers there. And so this is really the foundation of rigging in After Effects when it comes to building a control layer and using these expression controls that After Effects kind of expects us to use in this way, that if we have a scene with a whole bunch of complexity and a whole bunch of things going on, we could build a controller and use this pick whip system, this parenting system, to really be able to link data together. So After Effects, this is a really big part of it. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a foundation here. So let's move on to the next video.